September 1814. Vienna. The air hums with the sweet scent of victory, thick with the aroma of wax, expensive perfume, and power. In the ballrooms of the Hofburg Palace, monarchs and diplomats waltz, the masters of Europe gathered to redraw the map of the world from the wreckage of Napoleon's empire. This is a Congress of victors. Here is Tsar Alexander I of Russia, whose armies marched into Paris, the Austrian Chancellor Metternich, a cunning spider at the center of the continental web, King Frederick William III of Prussia, and the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh. They are all lions, ready to tear apart the legacy of their defeated foe. And among them, moving almost unnoticed, is a figure who should not be here. He is the representative of defeated, humiliated, occupied France, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, Prince of Benevento. He is lame, his face an impenetrable mask of aristocratic courtesy, but his cold, attentive eyes miss nothing. In this hall, he is a living paradox, a traitor who sold out his emperor, Napoleon, and yet the sole defender of his country. They call him the lame devil, a cynic who betrayed everyone he ever served, from the old royal regime to the revolution, from the Directory to the empire. The victors watch him with a mixture of contempt and curiosity, expecting to see a broken man, a beggar. They do not yet know that this man, leaning on his cane, has come not to plead, but to dictate. He has no army, no money, no support behind him, only his brilliant, ruthless mind and a profound understanding of human weakness. It is here, at this victor's ball, that the ultimate question will be answered. How will he, the greatest traitor of his age, not only save France from being carved up, but also deceive all the monarchs of Europe, turning defeat into his greatest triumph? This Congress will become his stage, and history, the witness to the greatest act of political artistry ever performed by a single man. To understand the genius and cynicism of Talleyrand, one must first immerse oneself in the world that created him, France in the late 18th century. It was a gilded cage, a magnificent facade hiding a rotten core. The age of enlightenment had reached its zenith. Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot had already detonated the intellectual foundations of absolute monarchy and church authority. Their ideas of liberty, equality, and human rights filled the air of Parisian salons, seeping into the minds of aristocrats and the middle class alike. At the same time, the French court at Versailles lived in a parallel reality, a world of lavish balls, complex etiquette, and colossal spending that was emptying the state's treasury. King Louis XVI, well-meaning but weak and indecisive, and his queen, Marie Antoinette, nicknamed Madame Deficit, became symbols of the monarchy's detachment from its people. Society was rigidly divided into three estates. The first was the clergy, which owned vast lands and was exempt from taxes. The second was the nobility, clinging to its feudal privileges with a desperate grip. And the third, making up 97% of the population, from wealthy bourgeois to destitute peasants, bore the entire weight of the tax burden. It was a world of screaming contrasts. Unbelievable luxury existed alongside horrific poverty, sophisticated philosophy with archaic superstition, the splendor of Versailles with bread riots in the provinces. Geopolitically, France, despite losing colonies in the 7 Years' War, was still considered a great power, but its prestige was tarnished, and its finances were in a state of permanent crisis, worsened by the costly support for the American Revolution. This system, which had seemed unshakable for centuries, was, in reality, a colossus with feet of clay, and the cracks in its foundation were becoming more and more visible. It was in this atmosphere of intellectual ferment and social decay, where old values were dead and new ones not yet born, that the character of the young Charles Maurice was forged. A world where survival depended on the ability to wear a mask, to say one thing and think another, and to sense which way the winds of change were blowing before anyone else. Into the very heart of this system, into one of the oldest and most noble families of France, the house of Talleyrand-Périgord, a boy was born in 1754, for whom fate seemingly had a brilliant future in store. Charles Maurice was the firstborn, the heir, destined by birth for a military career, court positions, and all the privileges the old regime could offer. However, as chronicles tell, a tragedy occurred in his early childhood that forever changed his life, and consequently, the history of Europe. Whether by falling from a chest of drawers or due to a nurse's carelessness, the child suffered a severe leg injury, resulting in a lifelong limp. In a world where physical prowess and military bearing were integral parts of the aristocratic ideal, this defect became an indelible stain. His own family, guided by cold dynastic calculation, deemed him unfit to be the head of the family. His birthright, the most sacred right of an aristocrat, was taken from him and given to his younger brother. For Charles Maurice, this was not just the loss of an inheritance, it was the deepest humiliation, a betrayal by those who should have loved and protected him. Instead of a sword and a uniform, he was destined for a cassock. The family decided that the only path for a cripple was a career in the church, where physical defects were less important than intellect and intrigue. He was sent to a seminary, forcibly deprived of his freedom of choice, and wedded to a God in whom he likely never believed. This stolen birthright and the stigma of being lame became the original sin of his biography, the unhealing wound that defined his entire future path. It bred in him an icy cynicism, a deep contempt for the hereditary privileges that were so easily taken from him, and an all-consuming, insatiable thirst for revenge, to prove to the world, and especially to his family, that he, the rejected son, would surpass them all. His limp became his constant companion and his secret weapon. It forced him to rely not on strength, but on intellect, not on a direct assault, but on an indirect maneuver, turning him into a master of psychology and manipulation. Deprived of the right to a sword, Talleyrand was forced to weaponize his mind. The ecclesiastical education that was meant to make him a humble servant of God instead became the forge for one of the most dangerous and sophisticated minds in Europe. The Collège d'Harcourt, the Saint-Sulpice Seminary, the Sorbonne. Here, he immersed himself not so much in theology as in the works of philosophers, historians, and economists. He studied human nature not from the lives of saints, but from the writings of Machiavelli and Montesquieu. His mind, sharpened by resentment towards his family and fate, absorbed knowledge with astonishing ease, but it was knowledge without faith, intellect without a heart. His tutors, as contemporaries testified, were simultaneously amazed by his brilliant abilities and appalled by his complete lack of a calling. He wore the cassock like a costume, performing church rites with the cold artistry of an actor playing a long, boring role. This period became for him a school of hypocrisy. He learned to hide his true thoughts behind pious phrases, his ambitions behind a mask of humility. Every day spent within the seminary walls was a reminder of his humiliation, of the life he had been denied. And this constant internal pain did not break him. It tempered him, turning his cynicism into a philosophy and his thirst for revenge into a strategy. He realized that the world was unjust, and that concepts like honor, loyalty, and duty were just beautiful words that the powerful used to cover their selfish interests. The only real values in this world were power, money, and influence, and he decided he would obtain them at any cost. Becoming Bishop of Autumn at 34, he gained not a spiritual office, but a political platform. He wasn't interested in the souls of his parishioners. He was interested in the revenues of the diocese and the influence this position gave him at court and in the coming political storms. He was a bishop by necessity, but a schemer by vocation, and his mind, honed by decades of hidden resentment, was ready for the great game that was about to begin. Having escaped the suffocating atmosphere of the seminary and received the bishop's mitre, Talleyrand dove headfirst into the only element where he felt at home, the swirling cauldron of Parisian salons of the late 18th century. These were not just places for polite conversation. They were the intellectual and political hubs of pre-revolutionary France, where intrigues were woven, reputations were made and broken, and the fate of the kingdom was decided over a game of cards or in a discreet alcove. Here, in the drawing rooms of Madame de Staël or Madame de Genlis, the young Bishop of Autun perfected the art of the mask. His inscrutable face, aristocratic restraint, and biting, subtle wit made him a welcome guest. He learned to listen more than he spoke, extracting priceless information from the chatter of others. He mastered the art of the compliment that could be sharper than a dagger, and the hint that was more eloquent than a direct statement. Women were his first and most loyal allies. He understood their influence and knew how to use them as sources of information and tools to advance his interests. In these salons, he studied the anatomy of power in minute detail. He saw how ministers gained and lost posts due to a favorite's whim, how financial magnates influenced state policy, how the ideas of philosophers became weapons in the hands of political factions. He understood that real power belongs not to the one on the throne, but to the one pulling the strings. Talleyrand turned his life into a one-man show, where he was the playwright, the director, and the lead actor. His limp, rather than being a disadvantage, became part of his image, causing people to underestimate him, to see him as just a witty salon regular, while he coolly assessed their strengths and weaknesses. It was here that he learned his most important lesson. In politics, there are no friends, only temporary allies, and any attachment is a weakness that will inevitably be used against you. He cultivated a reputation as a frivolous man who loved luxury, women, and gambling, and this mask of a sybarite reliably concealed his iron will and boundless ambition, which were waiting for their moment. That moment came in 1789, when King Louis XVI, driven to desperation by the country's bankruptcy, convened the Estates General, an assembly of representatives from the three estates that had not met for over a century and a half. Talleyrand, as Bishop of Autumn, arrived at Versailles as a deputy for the First Estate, the clergy. And here, against the backdrop of the emerging French Revolution, he committed his first great act of betrayal, which would forever define his reputation and his method. When the representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly and swore not to disband until they had given France a constitution, Talleyrand, a prince of the church and an aristocrat to the bone, did the unthinkable. He sided with the rebels. It was a cold, calculated move. He saw that the old regime was doomed, that the monarchy was in its death throes, and he bet on the new, rising power. But his most shocking step was yet to come. On November 2, 1789, as the young revolutionary government desperately sought funds to avoid collapse, it was the Bishop of Autumn who took the stage and proposed a brilliant and blasphemous solution: to nationalize the vast and immensely wealthy lands of the Church, placing them at the nation's disposal. For the clergy, it was a stab in the back. The man who should have been their defender became their gravedigger. He was betraying not just his class, he was betraying the God he had vowed to serve and the Church that had given him power and status. This act made him a hero to the revolutionaries and an apostate to the royalists and clergy. The Pope excommunicated him, but Talleyrand no longer cared. He cast off his cassock like a snake sheds its skin and threw himself into politics. This first betrayal was his baptism into a new era. He demonstrated his guiding principle: never attach yourself to ideologies, institutions, or people who are doomed. His loyalty belonged not to the past, but to the future, and more importantly, to himself. He burned all his bridges behind him, and now he could only move forward, stepping over the ruins of the old world he himself had helped to destroy. Behind the series of high-profile betrayals of his class, his church, his king, lay not just a lust for power or money, but a coherent, albeit deeply cynical, philosophy of life. Talleyrand's secret doctrine, forged in the crucible of personal humiliation and political chaos, was simple and ruthless. Regimes come and go. Ideologies change like the seasons. Emperors and kings are merely mortal men, subject to passions and mistakes. The only thing of enduring value, the only thing worth being loyal to, is France. But by France, he meant not the people or an abstract idea of a nation, but the state apparatus itself, its stability, its place in Europe, and its survival. And since he considered himself the most intelligent and capable man to manage this apparatus, the survival of France and his own personal survival and prosperity became synonymous. This selfish patriotism freed him from any moral obligations. If saving France and himself required betraying the king, he betrayed him. If it required serving the revolution that executed that king, he served it. If it required helping a Corsican general stage a coup and establish a dictatorship, he became the chief organizer. And if that dictator, having become an emperor, put France on the brink of destruction with his insatiable lust for glory, then he had to be betrayed and sold out to save the country from his madness. In his world, there was no good or bad. There was only useful or harmful to the interests of the state at that particular moment. He viewed politics as a doctor views a patient. If a part of the body is afflicted with gangrene, it must be amputated to save the whole organism, regardless of sentiment. Kings, revolutionaries, emperors, they were all just temporary tools for him. This doctrine allowed him to act with incredible flexibility and foresight. While others fanatically clung to their beliefs, royalists to the monarchy, Jacobins to the republic, Talleyrand hovered above the fray, seeing several moves ahead. His only true homeland was himself, and his highest virtue was survival. And it was this philosophy, polished to perfection, that allowed him not only to survive all the storms, but to emerge from them richer and more powerful than before. After the Jacobin Terror, which Talleyrand prudently waited out in exile in America, he returned to the France of the Directory, a weak, corrupt, and inefficient government. He quickly realized that this regime would not last long, and that the country needed a strong leader, a saber who could restore order. And he found that saber in the person of the young, ambitious, and incredibly talented general, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had returned triumphant from his Italian campaign. Talleyrand was one of the first members of the old aristocracy to see in this short Corsican, with a thick accent, not just a lucky soldier, but a genius capable of changing the course of history. Their meeting was a collision of two worlds and two types of intellect. Napoleon was a force of nature, a volcano of energy, a genius of war and direct action. Talleyrand was a master of backroom intrigues, quiet diplomacy, and long-term planning. They were complete opposites, and that is precisely why their alliance proved so effective. Talleyrand became Minister of Foreign Affairs and the chief architect of the coup of 18 Brumaire, November 9, 1799, which brought Napoleon to power as first consul. He used his old connections, his authority, and his powers of persuasion to provide political cover for the military seizure of power. He staked his reputation and his life on this comet named Bonaparte because he intuitively felt that this was the man who could restore the greatness of France. For Napoleon, Talleyrand was a priceless asset. He was his passport into the world of old European aristocracy, his tutor in the subtleties of diplomatic protocol, his link to the legitimacy that the upstart general so badly needed. Talleyrand helped Napoleon create a new state apparatus, negotiate with other powers, and consolidate his rule. It was a symbiosis. Napoleon gave Talleyrand the power and opportunity to realize his designs, while Talleyrand gave Napoleon polish, legitimacy, and strategic depth. Together, they formed the most powerful political duo in Europe, ready to turn the entire continent upside down. As the right-hand man of the first consul, Talleyrand unleashed his full potential. He was not merely the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was the chief architect of the foreign policy of Napoleonic France, which aimed for hegemony in Europe. His office on the Rue du Bac became a second center of power after the Tuileries Palace. It was Talleyrand who conducted the complex negotiations that sealed Napoleon's military victories into treaties favorable to France. The Treaty of Luneville in 1801 with Austria and the Treaty of Amiens in 1802 with Britain were his diplomatic masterpieces. They brought France a much-needed respite and secured its new borders along the Rhine and the Alps, something French kings had dreamed of for centuries. Talleyrand was a pragmatist. He understood that peace, at least a temporary one, was necessary for the stability of the new regime. He sought not endless conquests, but the creation of a balanced system in which France would hold a dominant, but not tyrannical position. He was one of the authors of the idea of natural frontiers and the creation of a belt of friendly satellite states around France. His diplomacy was a mixture of flattery, threats, bribery, and subtle psychological pressure. He knew how to find his opponent's weak spots and skillfully play on their contradictions. European monarchs simultaneously hated and respected this renegade, but they were forced to reckon with him. Talleyrand also played a key role in the reorganization of the German states in 1803, the so-called German mediatization, which eliminated hundreds of small feudal territories of the Holy Roman Empire and created larger states dependent on France in their place. This process not only simplified the map of Germany, but also brought Talleyrand enormous bribes from German princes eager to preserve or expand their domains. Napoleon knew about this and turned a blind eye, saying, "To stop him from stealing, you'd have to give him mountains of gold." He valued results, and Talleyrand delivered them. During this period, he was indispensable, transforming Napoleon's raw military force into a legitimate and stable European order, with France shining at its center. One of the most brilliant examples of Talleyrand's talent as a statesman and dealmaker was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. This episode demonstrated his global vision, pragmatism, and ability to extract maximum benefit from a seemingly unfavorable situation. The vast territory of Louisiana, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to modern-day Canada, had been returned to France from Spain. But Napoleon quickly realized that holding and developing such distant and extensive lands was practically impossible, especially with the British fleet dominating the seas. The looming war with Britain made Louisiana vulnerable to capture. Instead of passively waiting for the colony to be taken by force, Napoleon, pushed by Talleyrand, made a bold and unorthodox decision to sell it. The negotiations were entrusted to Talleyrand. The American envoys, James Monroe and Robert Livingston, had arrived in Paris with the intention of buying only New Orleans and part of Florida for $10 million. Imagine their astonishment when Talleyrand, with his characteristic composure, offered to sell them the entire Louisiana territory. After brief but intense bargaining, the parties agreed on a price of $15 million, or 80 million francs. From Talleyrand's perspective, it was a genius deal. First, France got rid of an asset it couldn't protect anyway. Second, it received a huge sum of money that was desperately needed to finance future wars in Europe. Third, and this was most important for the far-sighted diplomat, the deal nearly doubled the territory of the United States, turning it into a powerful continental power. Talleyrand foresaw that strengthening the U.S. would create a serious future geopolitical and economic competitor for his main enemy, Great Britain. He was essentially using French money to build a counterweight to British power in the New World. He said, "By this act, I will forever strengthen the power of the United States and give England a maritime rival that will sooner or later humble her pride." This was the quintessence of his style, turning an inevitable loss into a strategic gain, solving a current financial problem while planting a time bomb under his main adversary. When Napoleon decided to transform France from a republic into an empire, it was Talleyrand who became the master of ceremonies for this grand political spectacle. He understood that military force was not enough to secure Bonaparte's power. It needed the luster and legitimacy of ages. He was the one who persuaded Napoleon to adopt the title of emperor rather than king, so as not to offend republican sentiments while placing himself on a par with the ancient monarchies of the Habsburgs and Romanovs. Talleyrand threw himself into designing the new imperial court, reviving the forgotten etiquette of the old regime and blending it with new republican traditions. He created titles, positions, uniforms, and rituals designed to surround the former general with an aura of sacred authority. His task was to transform the Corsican upstart into a monarch equal in status to other European sovereigns. The culmination of this process was Napoleon's coronation in Notre Dame Cathedral on December 2, 1804. Talleyrand was one of the chief directors of this lavish ceremony. He conducted extremely difficult negotiations with the Vatican to persuade Pope Pius VII to come to Paris and personally participate in the coronation, an unprecedented act meant to give the new dynasty divine sanction. Although Napoleon snatched the crown from the Pope's hands at the last moment and placed it on his own head, and then on Josephine's, the pontiff's mere presence was a colossal diplomatic victory engineered by Talleyrand. However, while being the architect of the empire, Talleyrand was also becoming its most perceptive critic. He helped create the legend of Napoleon, but he did not believe in it himself. He saw how power was corrupting his master, how the modest first consul was turning into an arrogant emperor, obsessed with his own glory and his dynasty. He understood that the crown he had helped place on Napoleon's head could become too heavy, not just for the emperor, but for all of France. While managing the legend, he was already beginning to think about how to protect himself and the country in case that legend turned into a bloody tragedy. The turning point in the relationship between Talleyrand and Napoleon, the moment the loyal servant began to transform into a secret conspirator, occurred in 1808 in the German city of Erfurt. Napoleon, at the zenith of his power, organized a lavish congress there to demonstrate his authority to Europe and strengthen his alliance with Tsar Alexander III of Russia. Kings and princes from all over Germany flocked to Erfurt to pay their respects to the French emperor. The spectacle was magnificent, but behind the scenes, a very different drama was unfolding. Talleyrand, though removed from his post as foreign minister a year earlier, was invited by Napoleon as an advisor. And here, secretly from his master, he committed an act of unbelievable treason. He began holding separate talks with Tsar Alexander. During their clandestine meetings, often late at night, Talleyrand systematically undermined his own emperor's policy. He told Alexander, "Sire, why are you here? It is for you to save Europe, and you will only succeed in that by resisting Napoleon. The French people are civilized. Their sovereign is not. The sovereign of Russia is civilized. His people are not. Therefore, the sovereign of Russia should be the ally of the French people." It was a brilliant and fiendishly clever formula. Talleyrand was drawing a distinction between Napoleon and France, portraying the emperor as a tyrant whose boundless ambitions threatened not only Europe but France itself. He urged Alexander not to make concessions to Napoleon, especially on matters concerning Austria and Poland, and essentially advised him to sabotage the alliance treaty. This was treason in its purest form, a whisper of betrayal into the ear of his main geopolitical rival. What motivated Talleyrand? He saw that Napoleon, intoxicated by victories, was losing his grip on reality. The war he had started in Spain was turning into a bloody quagmire, and Talleyrand understood that the emperor was leading France to disaster. In Erfurt, he ceased to be Napoleon's servant and became the servant of his own doctrine, the doctrine of saving France, even at the cost of betraying its leader. He began to weave a web of conspiracy that, years later, would ensnare and destroy his emperor. The catalyst that finally convinced Talleyrand that Napoleon was leading the empire to ruin was the war in Spain. In 1808, Napoleon, seeking to completely subordinate the Iberian Peninsula and close it to British trade, made one of his greatest political blunders. Under the pretext of moving troops to Portugal, he effectively occupied Spain, lured the Spanish royal family, King Charles IV, and his son Ferdinand VII, to the French city of Bayonne, and there, through crude blackmail and threats, forced them both to abdicate. He then placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the vacant throne. Talleyrand, who was present during this sordid affair, was appalled by its clumsiness and cynicism. He called it a cloak and dagger intrigue. He understood that one could conquer an army, but one could not so brazenly and perfidiously deceive and humiliate an entire nation. He warned Napoleon, "One pays dearly for such things." And he was right. In response to the French occupation and the humiliation of their monarchy, a fierce popular uprising, the guerrilla, erupted across Spain. What was intended as a quick police action turned into a protracted, bloody, and brutal war, later dubbed the Spanish Ulcer. This war consumed France's best troops, diverting hundreds of thousands of soldiers from other fronts. It drained the treasury and undermined the myth of the Grande Armée's invincibility. For Talleyrand, the Spanish Ulcer was tangible proof that Napoleon's genius as a commander was giving way to the arrogance and recklessness of a tyrant. The emperor no longer listened to advice. He believed only in his star and in brute force. Talleyrand saw that this war was not in France's interest. It was dictated solely by the dynastic ambitions and insatiable lust for power of Napoleon himself. It was after Bayonne that Talleyrand definitively moved into internal opposition. He realized that the system he had helped build had become self-destructive, and while French soldiers were dying in the mountains of Spain, he, in Paris, began seeking allies like the Minister of Police Fouché to prepare for the inevitable collapse and to ensure a smooth transfer of power when the emperor fell. As Napoleon became more deeply mired in the Spanish War and prepared for new campaigns against Austria, Talleyrand dared to express his disagreement more frequently, albeit in his usual veiled manner. Their dialogues turned into duels between two worldviews. Napoleon, a man of war, believed that any problem could be solved by force, that victory on the battlefield legitimized any political adventure. Talleyrand, a man of diplomacy, believed that a lasting peace could only be based on a balance of power, on mutual respect for interests, and on maintaining at least the appearance of legality. He tried to convey to the emperor that endless wars were exhausting France, that its demographic and economic resources were not infinite, and that constant conquests only created new enemies and instability. With conquests, one can achieve anything, he said, except stability. But Napoleon, drunk on the glory of Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland, no longer heard the voice of reason. He saw cowardice in Talleyrand's caution and betrayal in his pragmatism. A famous scene occurred in January 1809, when Napoleon, having learned of the collusion between Talleyrand and Fouché, gave his former minister a public and furious dressing down. In the presence of the highest dignitaries of the empire, he screamed at Talleyrand, calling him a thief, an embezzler, and a traitor. He ended his tirade with the famous line, "You are shit in a silk stocking." Talleyrand stood, leaning against the mantelpiece, listening impassively to this torrent of abuse. When the emperor fell silent, he bowed slightly and said quietly to his neighbor as he left the room, "What a pity that such a great man should be so ill-bred." This episode revealed the full depth of the chasm that had opened between them. Talleyrand demonstrated his complete moral superiority over brute force. He realized that the emperor had become a madman, a god of war ready to sacrifice both France and all of Europe to his ego. From that moment on, personal dislike grew into a cold, calculated certainty that Napoleon had to be stopped at any cost for the good of civilization itself. The secret negotiations in Erfurt were just the beginning. Talleyrand, using his position and extensive connections, effectively created a shadow channel of communication between Paris and St. Petersburg, and later Vienna. He acted as a secret ally to two emperors, Russia's Alexander and Austria's Francis, against his own master. He supplied the Austrian envoy Metternich and the Russian representative Nesselrode with priceless information about the internal affairs of the French Empire, the mood in the army and society, and Napoleon's own plans. He didn't just pass on facts. He gave them strategic advice on how best to oppose the French emperor. He urged them not to fear Napoleon, assuring them that his power was not as solid as it seemed, and that fatigue from endless wars was growing within France. This was a game of life and death. If Napoleon had discovered the extent of this betrayal, Talleyrand would have faced a firing squad. But he played his game with incredible skill. He used society events, dinners, and casual encounters to pass coded messages and hints. He turned his mansion into a center of anti-Napoleonic opposition, where European diplomats could get a more objective picture of events than in official offices. His goal was multi-layered. On one hand, He genuinely believed he was restraining Napoleon's madness by pushing other powers to take a firmer stance, thereby trying to prevent even more destructive wars. On the other hand, he was preparing the ground for the future. He was demonstrating to European monarchs that not everyone in France supported the emperor's aggressive policies, that there was another France, reasonable, peace-loving, and ready to cooperate. And he was positioning himself as the leader of this other France. He was building a reputation as the man with whom they could negotiate after Napoleon's fall. It was a brilliant move. He was simultaneously sabotaging his boss and ensuring his own future, presenting his treason as the highest form of patriotism. He was a double agent, working not for a foreign intelligence service, but for his own concept of a future European order. As Napoleon's star began to wane after the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812, Talleyrand entered a state of patient waiting. He was removed from all official posts, but remained in Paris, in his luxurious mansion, which became a kind of political salon and observation post. While the empire cracked at the seams and Napoleon fought a titanic struggle against all of Europe, Talleyrand maintained an Olympian calm. Like a spider at the center of a web, he carefully watched the movement of armies, the diplomatic maneuvers, and the mood of Parisian society. He received dignitaries, generals, and financiers, listening to their fears and complaints, and letting each one know that the end was near. But there was a way out. He did not create an active conspiracy. That would have been too dangerous and crude. Instead, he created an atmosphere of the inevitability of Napoleon's fall. He sowed doubt, whispered about the need for peace at any price, and hinted that one must think about France's future after the emperor. His tactic was one of psychological warfare. He refused Napoleon's offers to return as foreign minister, understanding it would be like taking the helm of a sinking ship. This refusal was more eloquent than any statement. It showed the whole world that the cleverest man in France no longer believed in the emperor's star. While Napoleon was winning his last brilliant but now meaningless battles in the campaign of 1814, Talleyrand was in Paris, preparing the political ground for the restoration of the Bourbons. He maintained a secret correspondence with the brother of the executed king, the future Louis XIII, while simultaneously convincing the Allied monarchs, especially Tsar Alexander, that the return of the old dynasty was the only way to ensure stability in France and Europe. He was waiting for his moment, and that moment came when the Allied armies approached the walls of Paris. At the end of March 1814, as the Allied armies, Russian, Prussian, and Austrian, stood outside Paris, while Napoleon and the remnants of his army were far to the east trying to cut their communication lines, chaos and panic reigned in the capital. It was at this critical moment that Talleyrand made his decisive move. He essentially opened the city gates to the enemy. Officially, the defense of Paris was commanded by the emperor's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, but real power was already slipping from the Bonapartists' hands. Talleyrand, using his influence over the Paris municipality and high-ranking officials, did everything to paralyze the will to resist. He convinced them that a battle for Paris would only lead to the senseless destruction of a great city and thousands of casualties. He assured them that the Allies came not as conquerors, but as liberators bearing peace, and that he, Talleyrand, could negotiate honorable terms of surrender. He arranged for a delegation to be sent to Tsar Alexander with an offer of capitulation. On March 31, 1814, the Allied troops, led by the Russian emperor, triumphantly entered Paris. And where did the victor, the Tsar of all the Russias, go? Not to the Tuileries Palace, not to any other government building, but to Talleyrand's mansion on the Rue Saint-Florentin. This was more than a symbolic gesture. For several days, Talleyrand's home became the headquarters of the anti-Napoleonic coalition and the de facto capital of Europe. It was here, in his study, that the fate of France was decided. Talleyrand received the Tsar not as a petitioner, but as a host, as the representative of the real France that was tired of Napoleon's tyranny. He charmed Alexander with his intellect, his manners, and his apparent sincerity. This move was the pinnacle of his betrayal of Napoleon, but from his perspective, it was an act of supreme patriotism. He saved Paris from destruction and prevented a civil war by assuming the role of mediator between the defeated nation and victorious Europe. He personally handed the keys to his country to its enemies, only to then receive power from their hands and save what could still be saved. Having made Tsar Alexander his guest and, in essence, a hostage to his influence, Talleyrand immediately began to implement his plan. He became a kingmaker. Napoleon had not yet abdicated, his marshals were still loyal to him, and his name still inspired awe among the people. The allied monarchs hesitated. Tsar Alexander was leaning towards the idea of leaving Napoleon's son on the throne with his mother, Marie-Louise, as regent. The Austrians supported this option, as Marie-Louise was an Austrian princess. Even the enthronement of the Swedish crown prince Bernadotte, a former Napoleonic marshal, was considered. But Talleyrand was vehemently opposed to all these compromises. He understood that any regime associated with the Bonaparte name would mean permanent instability and war. He needed a clean slate. With brilliant persistence, he began to promote the only option he deemed viable, the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty in the person of Louis XVI. To this end, he introduced the famous principle of legitimacy into political discourse. He argued to the Allies that only a legitimate historical dynasty, overthrown by the revolution, could guarantee a lasting peace. Any other ruler, be it a regent or a general, would be a usurper, forced to constantly prove their right to power by force of arms. With principles, he said, one can do anything, and this principle of legitimacy became his main weapon. He convened his compliant Senate, which obediently voted to depose Napoleon and call Louis XVI to the throne. He formed a provisional government, which he himself headed. He convinced Marshal Marmont, who commanded a key corps covering Fontainebleau, where Napoleon was, to defect to the Allies. This defection deprived Napoleon of his last hope for a military comeback and forced him to sign his abdication. In just a few days, operating from his Paris mansion, Talleyrand, with no army or official position, managed to dismantle the entire structure of the Napoleonic Empire, depose the most powerful man in the world, and restore a dynasty that had been absent from France for over 20 years. Deposing Napoleon was only the first act. Talleyrand understood that even in exile on the island of Elba, the emperor remained a formidable force, a symbol of glory and a potential threat. The main battle was now being fought in the minds and hearts of the French people, as well as in the corridors of European diplomacy. Talleyrand operated on several fronts simultaneously to definitively outplay his former master. First, he led the peace negotiations with the Allies, and here he achieved the incredible. The Treaty of Paris, signed in May 1814, was surprisingly lenient for the losing side. France was not dismembered and retained its 1792 borders, which were larger than under the old kings. It paid no reparations and was not subjected to a long occupation. This was a colossal diplomatic victory, and Talleyrand presented it as proof of the advantages of the new Bourbon regime. He showed the French that Napoleon had brought them endless war and defeat, while he and the new king brought an honorable peace. Second, he actively worked to create a new constitutional monarchy. He knew that a simple return to pre-revolutionary ways was impossible. He became one of the authors of the Charter of 1814, which guaranteed civil liberties, preserved many gains of the Revolution, including the redistribution of property, and created a bicameral parliament. With this, he sought to reconcile the old aristocracy with the new elite created under Napoleon. Third, he continued his secret diplomacy, preparing for the Congress of Vienna. He studied in advance the interests and contradictions among the Allies, probing for weaknesses in their coalition. He knew that Russia and Prussia would want too much, which would worry Austria and Britain. He was setting the stage for his main performance, where he, the representative of a defeated country, would become the arbiter of Europe. He acted like a grandmaster who, having sacrificed his main piece, the emperor, continues the game, seeing a combination that will lead him to victory from a seemingly hopeless position. The checkmate to Napoleon was delivered not on the battlefield, but on the chessboard of European politics, and the main player was Talleyrand. Napoleon's sudden return from Elba in March 1815 and his triumphant march to Paris, known as the 100 Days, was a moment of truth and the greatest test for Talleyrand. At that moment, he was in Vienna, at the very heart of the Congress, weaving his intrigues. The flight of King Louis XVIII and the restoration of the empire seemed to undo all his achievements. Many in his place would have lost their nerve or tried to switch sides again to the victor. But Talleyrand did not flinch. He instantly understood that this final flight of the eagle would be short-lived and end in ultimate catastrophe. He immediately used the news to rally the Allies, whose disagreements had already brought the Congress to the brink of collapse. It was Talleyrand who authored the declaration, signed by all the powers, that declared Napoleon an enemy of humanity outside the law. With this, he cut off any path for the emperor to gain diplomatic recognition. He turned Napoleon's return from an internal French affair into a pan-European problem requiring an immediate military solution. While Napoleon in Paris was trying to assemble an army and convince everyone of his peaceful intentions, Talleyrand in Vienna was working to create a new, seventh anti-French coalition. His position was unshakable. No mercy, no negotiations with the usurper. He remained loyal not to King Louis XVIII, whom he secretly despised for his clumsiness, but to the principle of legitimacy that he himself had proclaimed. It was his riskiest, yet most consistent move. He bet everything on Napoleon's final defeat. He refused to answer his letters and offers to return. This final test of loyalty not to a man, but to his strategy, Talleyrand passed with flying colors. When news of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo reached Vienna, it only confirmed that he had been right. The 100 Days did not destroy his work, but strengthened it. They definitively discredited Bonapartism in the eyes of Europe and made the restoration of the Bourbon the only alternative, proving to everyone that only Talleyrand knew how to truly pacify France. And so we return to the glittering halls of the Congress of Vienna, but now we see the scene with different eyes. We understand the long and winding path this lame man traveled to be here. Talleyrand arrived in Vienna in September 1814 as the representative of a defeated nation, who at first was not even to be admitted to the main negotiations. The four great victorious powers, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain, intended to decide everything behind closed doors and then simply present France with a done deal. But they underestimated the fox they had let into the henhouse. Talleyrand began his game with an act of incredible audacity. At the very first meeting, he declared that he did not understand the term allies. Allies? He asked with icy surprise. Against whom? No longer against Napoleon, he is on the island of Elba. Certainly not against the King of France. He is the guarantor of peace. Gentlemen, if there are still allied powers, then I do not belong here. With this, he shattered their unity from the outset, turning the victors' coalition into a mere assembly of sovereign states, among which France was just like any other. Then he began to skillfully play on their divisions. He saw that Russia and Prussia had made a secret pact. Tsar Alexander wanted the entire Duchy of Warsaw, Poland, while the Prussian king sought the entire kingdom of Saxony as compensation. This excessive strengthening of Russia and Prussia mortally frightened Austria, which feared losing influence in Germany, and Britain, which always sought a balance of power on the continent. Talleyrand immediately sided with Austria and Britain, positioning France not as a defeated country, but as a defender of justice and equilibrium in Europe. He became the most ardent champion of the interests of small states, like Saxony, protecting them from Prussia's predatory ambitions. He, the representative of revolutionary and Napoleonic France, the country that had tried to destroy the old order for 2 decades, now acted as the chief defender of tradition and the legitimate rights of monarchs. It was the apotheosis of political Jesuitism and genius. Talleyrand's main weapon in Vienna was the principle of legitimacy, which he himself formulated and imposed on the Congress. The idea was simple and elegant. After decades of revolutions and wars, when thrones were seized and borders redrawn by force of arms, Europe must return to an order based on the legitimate hereditary right of monarchs to rule. Not conquest, but legitimacy should be the foundation of the New World Order. This principle was like a balm to the souls of the old monarchs, who secretly feared that the revolutionary contagion and the right of the strongest, demonstrated by Napoleon, would become the new norm. Talleyrand, a cynic who believed neither in the divine right of kings nor in any other ideology, used their own conservative values as a battering ram against their own selfish interests. When Prussia demanded Saxony, arguing that the Saxon king had been a loyal ally of Napoleon, Talleyrand retorted, "That is of no consequence. He is a legitimate monarch, and you cannot simply strip him of his throne and give away his kingdom. If we create this precedent, what guarantee is there that the same will not be done to one of you tomorrow?" With this, he trapped them in a logical corner. They could not dispute the principle that was the very foundation of their own right to rule. He turned France's weakness into its main strength. Since France had already renounced all its conquests and returned to its legitimate borders, it was the only country, he argued, that demanded nothing for itself and could act as a disinterested arbiter. He, the representative of the country that brought chaos to Europe, now dressed himself in the robes of the chief peacemaker and defender of order. He used tradition as the most modern and effective weapon, forcing the victors to play by the rules that he himself had written for them. This principle allowed him to save Saxony, curb the ambitions of Prussia and Russia, and most importantly, return France to the concert of Europe as an equal and respected partner. Seeing that his principle of legitimacy was successfully containing Prussia and Russia, Talleyrand went even further. His goal was not just to defend, but to definitively break up the coalition of victors and transform France from a bargaining chip into a key player. He began secret negotiations with Austrian Chancellor Metternich and British Representative Castlereagh, who were growing increasingly alarmed by the intransigence and growing power of Tsar Alexander and the Prussian king. Talleyrand skillfully fanned their fears, painting pictures of a future where a gigantic Russian empire would swallow Poland and extend its influence to the very heart of Europe, while an aggressive Prussia would become the dominant power in Germany. He convinced them that it was time to forget old grievances and form a new alliance based on common interests, the need to contain Russo-Prussian expansion. His efforts were crowned with stunning success. On January 3, 1815, a secret treaty was signed in deep confidentiality between France, Austria, and Great Britain. According to this treaty, the three powers pledged to provide military assistance to each other if one of them was attacked. It was a diplomatic masterpiece. Just a few months after all of Europe had been at war with France, Talleyrand managed to forge a military alliance with two of his main former enemies against the other two. He didn't just sow discord, he completely changed the balance of power at the Congress. Rumors of this secret treaty quickly leaked, and their effect was like a bombshell. The Tsar and the Prussian king, realizing they faced a united front and risked a new war in which they would have no advantage, were forced to compromise. Russia received a smaller part of Poland, and Prussia only the northern half of Saxony. Talleyrand had achieved his goal. He had split the Quadruple Alliance and returned France to the ranks of the great powers shaping the destiny of Europe. The pinnacle of Talleyrand's diplomatic artistry in Vienna was how he managed to turn France's crushing military defeat into a political triumph. When the Congress began, everyone expected France to be punished, humiliated, and possibly dismembered, stripped of Alsace, Lorraine, and other territories. Prussian generals like Blücher openly demanded harsh retribution, but when the final act of the Congress of Vienna was signed in June 1815, France not only retained its territorial integrity. Even after the Second Treaty of Paris following Waterloo, the terms were harsher but not catastrophic, but also became an integral part of the new system of European balance. How was this possible? Talleyrand convinced the victors that a strong but restrained France within its natural borders was essential for the stability of all of Europe. A France that was too weak and humiliated, he argued, would become a source of eternal revanchism and new revolutions. But a stable France under the legitimate Bourbon dynasty would be a reliable partner in maintaining order. He essentially offered them a deal. You do not humiliate France, and France, in turn, renounces revolutionary and Napoleonic expansionism and becomes one of the guarantors of the new conservative order. He saved his country from itself, from its own imperial ambitions that had led it to disaster. He persuaded Europe that peace with France was more important than revenge on France. The result was the creation of the Vienna system, which gave Europe nearly 40 years of relative peace, the longest period without major pan-European wars in many centuries. And one of the chief architects of this system was the representative of the defeated country. This was the final triumph of the lame devil. He lost the war but won the peace, deceiving all the monarchs of Europe and making them act in France's interest, even when they thought they were acting in their own. It would seem that after the Congress of Vienna and the restoration of the Bourbons, Talleyrand's career, having reached its zenith, should have declined. And indeed, under Louis XIV, and especially under his reactionary brother Charles II, he was out of favor, living in a kind of honorable retirement. The kings could not forgive him his revolutionary past and the ease with which he had served all regimes. But Talleyrand, as always, was simply waiting. And his final moment of glory came in 1830 during the July Revolution. When the people of Paris overthrew Charles II, who was trying to restore absolutism, the country was again on the brink of chaos. There was a real threat of a republic being proclaimed, and a new pan-European war, as the monarchs, loyal to the principles of the Vienna Congress, would not tolerate a revolutionary hotbed in the heart of Europe. And here, the 76-year-old Talleyrand made his last gambit. He immediately supported the candidacy of Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orléans, a representative of the younger branch of the Bourbon known for his liberal views. He saw in him the ideal compromise figure, a citizen king who could reconcile the monarchical principle with the gains of the revolution. It was Talleyrand who gave the famous advice: the Duke should go to Paris immediately and accept the crown. He then embarked on his last important diplomatic mission as ambassador to London. His task was to persuade the European powers, especially Britain, to recognize the new July monarchy regime, and he brilliantly succeeded. He used all his authority, charm, and experience to prove that Louis-Philippe was not a new revolutionary threat, but rather a guarantee of stability and the best remedy for anarchy. He played a key role in the creation of an independent Belgium, securing its neutrality and preventing a major war over the issue. He served yet another king whom he had helped bring to power, and he probably would have betrayed him too, had circumstances and the interests of France required it. But now he was old and felt his time was running out. He had proven one last time that he was the unsurpassed master of political survival and adaptation. The death of Talleyrand in May 1838 was as theatrical and full of double meaning as his entire life. Feeling the end was near, this man, who had been excommunicated by the Pope almost half a century earlier, who had served a revolution that confiscated church property, and who had displayed a complete indifference to religion his whole life, suddenly decided to reconcile with the church. For several weeks, his bedroom was visited by the highest-ranking clergy of Paris, urging him to sign a formal retraction of his past errors, primarily his role in the civil constitution of the clergy. Talleyrand held out until the very last moment. He edited the text of the retraction, arguing over every phrase as if it were another diplomatic treaty. He signed it just hours before his death. Was this act one of sincere repentance, or the final, most subtle mockery of a cynic who wanted to depart with all due propriety and ensure a lavish church funeral for himself? No one knows the answer. When King Louis-Philippe came to visit the dying man, Talleyrand, gathering his last strength, uttered his famous courtly words: "Sire, this is the greatest honor my house has ever received." His last words, addressed to his caregivers, were, "I am suffering like the damned." This phrase, spoken by the lame devil on the threshold of eternity, became his final enigma. He departed, leaving behind a will that forbade the publication of his memoirs for 50 years, as if wishing to continue his game even after death, teasing the curiosity of posterity. His passing marked the end of an entire era. It was not just a man who died, but a living embodiment of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the last great aristocrat of the old regime who became one of the principal creators of the New World. And even his peace with God was made on his own terms at the last moment, like the final brilliant deal of his incredible life. The legacy of Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord is as contradictory and multifaceted as the man himself. For 2 centuries, his name has been synonymous with political betrayal, cynicism, and lack of principle. To royalists, he was a traitor to his class and king. To devout Catholics, an apostate who sold his faith. To Jacobins, a treacherous aristocrat who served tyrants. To Bonapartists, a Judas who sold his emperor. Napoleon himself, on St. Helena, gave a devastating assessment, calling him the main cause of his misfortunes. This image of the lame devil, a genius of evil, became firmly rooted in the popular consciousness. However, as time passed and passions cooled, historians began to offer a more complex and nuanced picture. A different view emerged, Talleyrand as a great patriot who, unlike Napoleon, never placed personal glory above the interests of France. In this interpretation, all his betrayals were merely changes of employers, while his one and only master, France, remained the same. He served not regimes, but the state. He was the doctor who used painful and at times immoral treatments to save a patient on the brink of death. His supporters point out that it was he who stopped Napoleon's mad wars of conquest, saved Paris from destruction in 1814, secured incredibly lenient peace terms for a defeated France, and returned it to the family of European powers. He was one of the architects of the Vienna system, which, for all its flaws, gave Europe decades of peace. He was not an idealist, but a pragmatist to the core, who understood that in politics, especially in an era of change, absolute loyalty is a path to suicide, and flexibility is the key to survival. Thus, the debate about him is the eternal debate about the nature of politics. What is more important, moral purity and adherence to principles, or the final result, the well-being of the state? Was he a traitor or a savior? The answer most likely is that he was both at the same time, and it is in this paradox that his enduring greatness and historical significance lie. So how did the lame devil manage to sell out Napoleon and deceive all the monarchs of Europe? The solution to this paradox lies in the unique combination of his personal qualities, his life experience, and his profound understanding of the era. He sold out Napoleon because he concluded that the emperor, having transformed from the nation's savior into its tyrant, had become the main threat to France's survival. Betraying Napoleon was, for him, the logical continuation of his service to the state. When a tool, the emperor, becomes dangerous, it must be discarded. He did it not out of hatred, but with the cold calculation of a surgeon amputating a diseased limb. He was able to deceive all the monarchs of Europe because he never tried to break the rules. On the contrary, he used their own rules, their own values, legitimacy, balance of power, European equilibrium against them. He did not lie to them. He told them what they wanted to hear, appealing to their deepest fear, the fear of chaos and revolution. He, a product of chaos, presented himself as the chief champion of order. His limp, his aristocratic background, his excommunication from the church. Everything that seemed to be his weakness was actually his strength. His childhood injury taught him to rely on his mind, not on force. His aristocratic upbringing gave him a perfect understanding of the psychology of the ruling class, and his break with the church freed him from moral dogmas. He was a man without illusions in an age full of fanatics. While Napoleon believed in his star, Tsar Alexander in his mystical mission, and other monarchs in their divine right, Talleyrand believed in nothing but human interest and circumstances. This gave him a colossal intellectual advantage. He saw the world not as it should be, but as it is, and therefore he could control it. He didn't deceive them in the literal sense. He simply understood them better than they understood themselves, and he used this knowledge to achieve his goals, which, he was convinced, coincided with the goals of France. Ultimately, the story of Charles Maurice de Talleyrand is not just the biography of one of the most successful and unprincipled politicians in history. It is a profound philosophical reflection on the very nature of power, loyalty, and survival. Talleyrand leaves us with a series of eternal and uncomfortable questions. Where is the line between betrayal and supreme patriotism? Is serving the abstract idea of the state a justification for immoral acts and breaking oaths given to specific people? And is it even possible to engage in high politics while keeping one's hands and conscience clean? His life is a hymn to pragmatism and the superiority of intellect over brute force and ideological fanaticism. He showed that in a world where everything changes, it is not the strongest or the most loyal who survives, but the most adaptable. His shadow still lies over the corridors of power worldwide, reminding politicians that sometimes the cleverest move on the chessboard is to change the color of the pieces you are playing with at the right time. The lesson of Talleyrand is that history is written by the victors, and the victor is most often not the one who shouts loudest about his principles, but the one who quietly and cleverly weaves his web in the shadows. He is an eternal reminder that behind the glittering facades of empires, behind the loud declarations and sacred oaths, there is always cold, ruthless calculation, and whoever masters its laws can rule the world, even while leaning on a lame leg and holding nothing sacred but a single, all-consuming idea: survival.